Hello, everyone. Sorry for the slight delay. We were having a bit of a technical issue. I will not at all take into much time and very quickly introduce you to our panelists for today. So today's topic is labor rights, challenges in global supply chains, the case of informal workers. And I have with me Sandhya Dhruv, who is a labor lawyer in theory and practice. She's based in London. And she is joined by Gopinath Parakuni, who is the General Secretary of Civida. So I would now invite Sandhya to uh, very quickly take us through our presentation. Thank you.
We've got some feedback from someone. I don't know who from, but thank you very much, Alina, for that. We've got some feedback from someone. No?
Okay.
Someone mute.
You can begin the session and I will see the feedback and questions.
Someone.
Yes.
Welcome everyone. Sorry for the delayed start to the seminar, but hopefully we will make time and you will forget the frustration of having had to wait. Thank you to Alina for that introduction, and to you and to Oxfam India for all your work in organising this course and keeping the debate going in challenging times. Welcome to you all. So in this session, I will talk for 22 minutes, unpacking some of these key ideas in our title: labor rights challenges in supply chains, the case of then I will go into a Q&A with Gopinath to talk about the experience of workers in Bangalore. Gopinath works for an NGO. He's my invisible colleague at the moment, but he works for an NGO in Bangalore, and we'll see if he can have some practice. And then in the second half, we will open it out to a discussion with questions and indeed shared experience from you. We know there are participants in this webinar from several different countries. You don't have to say who you are, but please do if you're happy to say so and say where you're speaking from. You will find on the right of your screen familiar, yes, I'm sorry, Alina, someone is talking. I don't know who it is, but I've got. Gopinath, can you mute your mic?
He is already on mute.
Well, someone is on. I'm getting feedback from somewhere, and there are complaints from the people who are participating.
I'm not sure if you can hear me. I'm a participant, and I think you should be able to unmute everyone, because now I'm able to unmute myself, which normally should be.
You'll find on the right of your screen a questions box. Please put in questions, but also please put in comments, contributions, shared experiences. We know that there are different countries represented here, and this is as much as everything to share experiences. And we've saved half the session to do that, so please do that. So in a minute, I'm going to ask Alina to release the first poll. Your last webinar, for those of you who attended it, was about due diligence, and I'm sure that Tara and Namit would have mentioned the projected EU due diligence legislation, which may occur next year. And in introducing something, and I'm going to ask you to decide what you think he said. So I'm asking the poll. The poll is now open to you. Alina, have we got a result for the poll? People completing it?
Yes, I'm just sharing the results with you.
Good.
You see it?
Do I need to stop sharing my screen?
No, it should be visible on your screen. The 32% of the participants have voted for the ecosystem, 17% have voted for our international economic system, 13% have voted for the supply chain system, and 38% have voted for our international social system.
Thank you for reading that out. Well, that's what I call a good spread of answers, and in a way, all those answers have got some correctness. So it was a bit of a trick question, but of course, what I wanted to bring out, what we wanted to bring out, is that there is definitely a sustainability element in the whole issue of supply chains, and in particular inequality, which in the end underlines what we're going to talk about today. So, starting now, labour rights challenges into global supply chains, the case of informal workers. Who are informal workers? What is informal work? This is a concept from ILO measurement, statistical work, when they're looking at the labour market. First of all, the ILO began by looking at informal economies, and then they drilled it down into looking at informal work. What are the elements of the ILO definition? First of all, informal jobs exist if the employment relationship is in law or in practice not subject to national labour law legislation, not subject to income taxation, and these two are alternatives. There is no social protection or entitlement to certain employment benefits, so not protected either by the state or by the employer. Early example from my own practice, early in my career, I was approached by a Bangladeshi client who worked as a chef in a restaurant in East London. And in the UK, there is a statutory right to have pay slips, which show how much you're paid, what's deducted for national insurance, what's deducted for tax. He was getting some money, but he wasn't being told how it was calculated, and he wasn't being told if it was being taxed. And he spoke very little English, but he knew that he was entitled to this payslip. He asked for his payslip and he was promptly sacked. So he came to the law centre where I worked, and we succeeded in winning the case that he had been retaliated against because he had asserted a statutory right. But of course, in the meantime, he'd lost his job. Now, there is an example of someone in informal work trying to move to formal work. I'll give you another recent UK example. You may have heard that in the UK there is a government protection scheme. The risk was when lockdown happened here that many people would be put out of work by their employers. And so the government had a scheme where the government paid 80% of income of those who were paid, but through pay as you earn, which is processed through a payroll, tax is paid, national insurance is paid. Many casual workers were not paid in that way, and so they did not have that protection. They were excluded from that protection because the nature of their work was informal. So why does any of this matter? Why do we need to categorise people in this way? The ILO have an explanation which you can read for yourselves on the screen as to some of the reasons why people may enter informal work and why informal work may occur. There have been a number of studies of this, but the ILO recommendation in 2015 on moving from informal work to formal work set out some of the reasons. First of all, there is a link with poverty, a link with low education, a link with vulnerability. Some people prefer to break it down into vulnerable workers, precarious workers, but there is that link. And so informal work, as the ILO sees it, is to undermine sustainable work, decent work. And of course, now in these days, we've seen that informal work crucially leads to an increased vulnerability to COVID-19. Let's look at the picture across South Asia. So 2 disclaimers with this slide. I don't pretend that these are accurate ratios of the sizes of the relevant countries, and apologies to those of you who are either represented as smaller, your country is smaller, than it should be. The other disclaimer is that these figures are from 2018. The figures from the Maldives, Sri Lanka and Bhutan are in fact from local other sources. And of course, the figures are changing all the time. But the broad picture is that in South Asia, informal working is an overwhelming proportion of the workforce, 80 to 90%. To put that into context, the figure from Europe would be 18% informal working. And so we can see that there is a massive issue here in this category. We need, of course, and Gopinath will say this later, and he said it in conversation with me, that one needs to break down the informality of working into who are we talking about? Own account workers, family workers, agriculture, urban workers. But you might think that the problems of informality, of precariousness, of exposure to COVID are the same if those elements of social protection, taxation and protection of the law in law or fact are not present. But certainly we will, when we look at on the ground evidence with Gopinath, start to break down this large proportion into sectors and types of work. Next, some figures from the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. Here I've set out, this is a research that was published in December 2019. We can see that women, there are a larger percentage of women in vulnerable employment. The red line along each blue line is the percentage of men in those countries, always less represented. I don't have figures from Afghanistan, Bhutan, or the Maldives, but we can see that the Maldives and Sri Lanka have a lesser percentage of informal employment overall. So that's informal employment. Let's now look at the labour rights of these informal workers. Now, I want to start by just grappling with this issue of labour rights as human rights, because some of you may be thinking, well, hang on, labour rights are what you get when you enter into a contract with your giver of work, with your employer. Or there is still a debate about whether socio-economic rights are best left as matters of policy to national governments, to be decided by each national government in its stage of development. And most people who are participating here will know about the different routes taken by the two UN covenants on civil and political and social and economic rights. So can we say that labour rights are human rights? Well, there are a number of answers to that. First of all, we should look at human rights as rights in the real world as they affect people. And as has been said in a declaration in 1993 in Vienna Declaration, human rights are indivisible. Look at people as they are, look at the rights holders as much as the rights. Rights should be real and effective and not theoretical and illusory. There is no point in having a right to family and private life if you don't have the means to feed yourself and your family. So that's the first answer. We can debate that at the end. A second answer is this, that perhaps if you think about the classic human right, you may think about the right to life, the right to freedom of torture, but up there somewhere is going to be the right not to be enslaved, the right to freedom from labour, from forced labour, from bonded labour. And that is a labour right. And that's unquestionably a human right. And when we look at the way that the ILO has directed the understanding of this, we have moved from an idea that slavery is about being shackled and moved across the Atlantic to the idea that freedom can in fact be seen in reduced choices deriving from hunger, deriving from poverty. And so forced labour can be exploitation derived from a limitation in choices. And that slavery and forced labour have a very high status as human rights today. Last year, the Canadian Supreme Court in the case of Nevson held that it had jurisdiction over a case because the claim was about forced labour. Now, the key is this: if we want to respect that right not to be subjected to forced labour, one of the ways that it can be done by companies is to promote decent work as a way of avoiding the worst forms of violations of human rights. And so that's why labour rights issues are human rights issues. The existence of freedom from slavery and forced labour, as you saw with Professor Deva yesterday, the relevance of the Sustainable Development Goals, the presence of the right in Article 7 of the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights of Just and Fair and Conditions of Work, and the ILO 1998 Declaration. In 1998, the ILO set out 8 conventions which it held were binding on all member states of the ILO, regardless of whether they'd ratified the conditions: forced labour, freedom of association, equality and discrimination, and child labour were the 4 subjects in the 8 conventions. The ILO has, I think, over 190 conventions, and they wanted to focus on the fundamental ones. I want to mention one more thing before I proceed, which is something extremely important that Professor Deva said yesterday, which is that the right of companies, the corporate right, is to respect human rights. It's not a right to respect national law. It's a right to respect human rights. Sorry, a duty to respect human rights. And so if national law has fallen short, let's say by suspending certain labour rights, that does not absolve the company of its right. And that's an extremely important point, which I'd invite you to keep in mind. So let's look at 4 specific concrete rights that I would like to focus on. One is the right to be able to organise collectively. This is one of the 4 core ILO conventions in 1948, and then followed a year later by the Convention prohibiting victimisation against trade unionists. Of the South Asian states, Bhutan is not an ILO member, and a question to the relevant minister in February this year elicited that they had no plans to join. Bangladesh ratified just after independence, Maldives in 2013, Sri Lanka in 1972, and then the second convention in 95, Pakistan in 51 and 52. Nepal has ratified the later convention, Convention 98, on victimisation of trade union organisers, but it hasn't ratified ILO Convention 87. And you'll see who's missing. India and Afghanistan have ratified neither. Again, one goes back to the crucial point that Professor Deva made yesterday. That's not a reason for companies not to respect it. And it would be easy to insert a clause into a supply contract and monitor whether or not there is recognition, at least in form, or there would need to be further enforcement in fact. But it makes sense. Trade unions are an early alerter of severe exploitation in workforces, and we know that informal workers are the very people who need to be able to exercise collective bargaining power because they have very little individual bargaining power. They are not highly paid IT experts who can exercise individual bargaining power. So that's the first right I wanted to focus on. Being safe at work, need I say more in the days of COVID? It's not an ILO core convention, but it is a just and fair system of work. It is an element of decent work. And in the days of COVID-19, it can engage the right to life. And the Oxfam report on tea conditions in Assam, which was, I think it was late last year, I think November last year, exposed the fact that many tea plantation workers were not being given clean water, and so were getting typhoid and diphtheria. Clearly a violation of this aspect of decent work. Generally, states deal with this through labour inspections on the decrease across the world, but companies can conduct their own labour inspections, and the best ones do. Next one, being paid a minimum living wage. I've used those two words advisedly. The first issue is obviously national minimum wages, important for dealing with the worst violations. Certainly had a massive impact in the UK when minimum wages were legislated for. I just want to deal with, as it were, the elephant in the room here. Minimum wages in Delhi for semi-skilled workers for an 8-hour day are 626 rupees. I hope my maths is good. In Jharkhand, it's 287 a day. And in London, the national minimum wage for an 8-hour day is 6,500 rupees, 96 paise. See the equivalent to that. And we also think to pause and think, well, why do people move supply chains? Why do companies move supply chains if they're not going to for a particular resource? Clearly, when one's looking at labour rights, cheaper labour is a factor here, and we should bear that in mind. So there is an inequality. There is a country inequality and cross-state inequality there. So that's national minimum wages, and they have their function. And again, that's why it is worrying that there is a suspension in some cases, as I understand, because the Indian Supreme Court in the Bandura case measured the minimum wage as a way of identifying whether there was greater exploitation. If people were working for below the national minimum wage, below the basic floor, it was an indicator that worse exploitation was going on. And so the national minimum wage has a function, but we're looking here at the human right, which should be respected by companies. And both Oxfam and the Ethical Trade Initiative have strongly advocated payment of a living wage, a wage which in fact allows people to enjoy their human rights, and that is significantly higher. In India, it's, as I understand it, 381 rupees for a single adult for a day, 749 for a family. You can see significantly higher than the national wage. It's a wage that enables people to exercise their other human rights, and again, it's an aspect of decent work. And again, this would be easy for a company to do. Ring fence in the supply contracts the amount of the minimum amount that people should be paid. Don't squeeze for the lowest cost you can possibly get that will then be passed on to the workers. One further thought on this, and I'd welcome your views. It seems to me that the Indian government's proposal and project to get people paid in, have their wages paid into bank accounts was potentially a good move in the direction of formality. But again, I know Gopinath may have a different view, and some of you may do. And there are other approaches as well. So the Oxfam report, which I suggest, it's called Addressing the Human Cost of Asymmetries. It's an excellent report, but it identified that for the UK, for example, 66.8% of the price of black tea went to supermarkets and tea brands, 66% of the final consumer price, and the labour cost to pay the people who picked the tea leaves in the first place was 4% of the final price. And so some organisations, Oxfam, the Ethical Trading Initiative, are looking at, should you not be giving a fairer share of the value, the ultimate value of the product. There is a case which is about to be brought against British American Tobacco in the UK concerning child labour and forced labour picking tobacco in Malawi, and that is arguing that British American Tobacco have unjustly enriched themselves at the expense of children and forced labour, child labour and forced labourers in Malawi. The fourth specific right I want to look at is maximum working hours. This is, as you may know, this was the subject of ILO Convention number 1, the very first one, and it provided that convention for 8-hour days and 48-hour weeks. There was some resistance, and had been some resistance for a while, that this would stymie competition. But in 1919, this convention was passed, and I don't know whether any of you know, it provided, I said, for an 8-hour day and 48-hour weeks. Does anyone know what Article 10 of that convention said? There was a specific exemption for so-called British India. British India, unlike all other proposed ratifiers of the convention, ILO members, there was a working week of 60 hours. And so it's a cruel irony that some states in India have now suspended the maximum on working hours. I'm conscious of the time, so these are obviously principles which also apply to decent work, dignity, being free of harassment in the workplace, freedom, not having your reduced choices, further reduced through exploitation, and equality, although that is generally understood to be equality between men and women on grounds of race, caste, but not pay equality of the type that we looked at, and perhaps Commissioner Vendors was looking at. These all, I would say, engage the responsibility of the corporation as end giver of work. But what about the wider picture across many South Asian states? The poverty that causes people to enter into debt bondage through recruitment fees. And at the other side, I don't know if you can see it, it's, sorry, the other end of it, it may be obscured by the chat, but the hunger that people are forced into if their work is terminated without any proper fair exit provisions. These are part of the wider picture, but companies should not simply leave them outside the walls of the workplace. They engage, we say, the responsibility of the corporation as a member of the community. So they affect some of the decisions on decent work at work, but the wider picture should also be taken on when considering recruitment practices, when considering termination practices. So, for example, again, termination without any notice during COVID-19. I want to move quickly to impact. So you looked yesterday at causes, contributions, and impacts. This is an excellent definition which shows that what we should be considering is what is the impact of the particular business activity. That's the question, and crucially the significance of that is that it may cover omissions as well as what may be seen as omissions as well as acts. So let's now look at some of the impacts which, just prior to speaking to GOPINATH, some of the impacts which may occur through supply chain activity. We've picked supply chains notionally between the UK and India because I'm based in London and GOPINATH is based in Bangalore. You've heard a lot about the changes in parent company culture from parent companies whose sole concentration is the maximization of profit and shareholder involvement, to a move to more wider involvement of stakeholders. That is a good first step, but in order to make the rights of the people that GOPINATH and his colleagues advise effective, it is not sufficient. So that's one challenge. Parent company culture needs to change, and I'll be asking GOPINATH about that. The next challenge is casualisation. In the UK, as in India, there is a move from long-term stable employment to casual workers, and I've mentioned a couple of examples so far. Outsourcing, and that continues in the supplier country as well as in the buyer country. I just want to say a quick word about the supply contracts. So often we see very little of them because they're covered by business confidentiality, and indeed there's a degree of secretiveness about them. 4 challenges arise in terms of the impacts. One is the context in which supply contracts are agreed. Very often there'll be a sustainability team, and then the team that negotiates the contracts will be a different team, one that pushes price, pushes the delivery times. And so the context is one of inequality of bargaining power. What is the impact of that? Well, it may create a more volatile labour market to try to deal with contracts which are volatile and not stable, and we'll look more at that by sector. The second challenge in terms of supply contracts, and no, I'll go to that afterwards, but the second challenge in terms of supply contracts is the so-called squeeze, asking for lower costs, asking for quicker delivery times. The suppliers almost inevitably pass on those demands to the workers in the form of lower wages and higher working hours. Again, on the plus side, supply contracts offer an ideal opportunity to build in clauses so-called, some people call them level playing field clauses or protective clauses, ring fencing wages, ring fencing working hours. But in many, over half of the cases, very often they're not done. But there are some very good models for doing that in some of the sectoral initiatives. And then finally, invisibility down. Sorry, I should have said on supply contracts, contract cancellation at short notice, often when work has been done, leading to catastrophic effects for workers. I want to deal lastly with invisibility down tiers. There are some companies, UK companies such as Marks and Spencer. If you go to Marks and Spencer and Google supply chain, you can see the factories where their supplies are. Number of women, number of men, an excellent visible record of the workers at tier 1. It's actually it's dated January 2020, so they don't have visibility after this January. There is a website called Respect the Chain, which again is excellent for tracing where a product comes from. But below that, tiers 2, where you might get components, tiers 3, where you might get materials, there is much worse visibility, and I'll talk to Gopinath about that. State business state nexus ought to be a virtuous circle where both the state and business work together to uphold human rights. At worst, it can be corporate capture where the state is corrupt, business takes advantage of a corrupt state, violence against human rights defenders, which you'll hear about later, and a general race to the bottom. And again, here, bear in mind that hugely important point that Professor Deva made yesterday, which is the fact that the state is weak and racing to the bottom in the hope of getting inward investment does not absolve business from its duty to respect. I'm going to finish with an anecdote. I'm going to finish from an anecdote from the UK, because one of the predictions is that we may see more localized supply chains, and maybe this will be more sustainable. There's a company which some of you may know called Boohoo, which supplies fast fashion. And when we went into lockdown in the UK, many companies found that their supply chains closed as borders closed. But Boohoo was able to suddenly produce lots of jumpsuits and pajamas for people to live in lockdown, and made a big boom business from this. And there have been investigations for a while into Boohoo, but a Financial Times investigation has uncovered people working in very poor conditions in Leicester, which is where Boohoo had their factory, which is why they were able to make all these items, get these items made quickly, working for half the national minimum wage in the UK. And so I think the lesson from that is that localized supply chains may not get rid of the problem. It still exists. And the final thing I want to say to that is Leicester has just had a spike in COVID-19, and it is the only country now the only city now in the UK under lockdown. So that's a quick tour of you will get these slides later. That's a quick tour of the key concepts in this webinar. I want to now talk to Gopinath through Q&A, and then we'll open it up to wider discussion. So, Gopinath, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes. We've got your voice, so your disembodied voice at the moment.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. So, Gopinath, can you tell us a bit about the work of Cividet?
Okay. Yeah. I must say that we were founded. One of the reasons was we saw the balance of payment crisis in 1989. We saw the big slogans, liberalization, privatization, and globalization, and those were slogans at that time. And many of us didn't quite know what's going to happen. But academics, researchers and analysts were pretty clear that, of course, neoliberal economic agenda might benefit middle and upper classes, but a large section of our, marginalized groups, Dalits, indigenous people, women, minorities. They all might not, their condition might not improve from what it was. So I mean that was the premise, and so we all, some of us got together and try to see how far can we support the struggles of these excluded and marginalized workforce. So we actually started working more intensively in around 2000. By that time, of course, the liberalization trend, had taken roots. I mean, like at least started growing roots in India. And I mean, our first work was in the garment industry, because you see, it's largely women, and I mean, the convenience was that it was in our backyard. The big industry at that time it was around 200,000 workers. Now it has doubled or more. So we could see the condition in which they worked. And I mean, I'll go to the other sectors, but quickly, one of the things that we did was to do a survey of how many cases are there in the labor force. There were very few. I mean, for 200,000 workers, and we know there are violations continually. I mean, why aren't cases coming up? I mean, the fact was that these are largely women from rural areas, gone to school for a few years, and they were simply not able, to take up on any of the issues, the way they are being treated. I mean, they didn't simply know that what kind of protection they have, and there weren't trade unions. I mean, trade unions did make some attempts, but the industry was pretty strong and kind of pretty determined, to defeat any kind of organizing. Anyway, so I mean, the garment sector, and we got kind of completely immersed in the garment sector issues, and then in 2006, Nokia opened its largest plant in near Chennai, a place called Sriperumbudur, and it was, I mean, at that time it was the largest assembling plant in Asia, and we also started looking at working conditions in the electronic sector. And we were surprised to see that the wages of the electronic sector workers, who would have gone to school 10 years, 12 years, they did their high school and then went on for some technical training, they were not getting much more than the garment workers. One would imagine they might get more, but they weren't. So we could see that the basic operators, were getting slightly more than what the garment workers. But that's a long story. There was spontaneous organizing among the Nokia plant, and networking pressure from Europe made Nokia sit with the workers, and trade union was recognized in Nokia. And in around 2010, when the factory closed down, not because of labor organizing, but because of I mean, yeah, they were not good at smartphones, and Samsung overtook them, by leaps and bounds, So at that time, they gave a decent severance pay. I mean, we can't imagine that. I think it will be one of the best severance pays that was ever paid in the Indian industrial history. So they took care, of the training. They gave some training for workers in new kinds of employment. They gave a severance pay, and workers were generally sort of, there were complaints, but generally satisfied with what they got. Yeah. So I mean, and then we started also working in the leather industry. These are all in Tamil Nadu. South India accounts for 50% or more of the leather export from India. So we looked at that, and that's a very bad scene, especially tanneries. You see, the problem with the leather industry is that most employees, most workers are either Dalits, or Muslims, or from very so-called lower castes, already excluded people or already excluded communities, and the working conditions are not good. I mean, it increasingly became a little more better in factories, in the bigger factories, the first tier suppliers of big brands, big fashion street, high street brands. They are slightly better off because of the auditing and other things, but things are still bad there. And then we also have been working in plantations, mostly in Tamil Nadu, the Nilgiris, a little bit, with our associates in Assam, You know, so I mean, yeah, broadly these are our the sectors that we are working. But at the same time, you know, we also started following the UN guiding principles. You see, we look to these instruments more and more. Looking at the first case I cited, then looking at the incapacity of workers to organize, the incapacity of workers and real representation and lack of freedom of association. Desperately we look for international standards, you see, because we see that in these factories it is social auditing by the brand companies, the parent companies, which seems to have made things slightly better than actual inspection by our inspectorates.
And why is that?
So yes, I mean, yeah, see, I mean, it's lawyers would say that India has one of the best labor jurisprudence, right from independence, but of course, we also had traditionally very strong trade unions, but they were all in the formal sector, public sector. I mean, banking and insurance, heavy industry, publicly owned industries. So these railways, these were where the trade unions were strong. And I'm sorry to say that though trade unions made attempts, they were not very successful in organizing the new supply chains, workers in the new supply chains. Of course, plantations is not a new supply chain. Plantation industry has always been there, and plantation is in a place where organizing did happen. And especially in South India, the organizing brought a lot of benefits to workers. So the point is this, that a large number of workers, especially in the new supply chains, are not organized. And therefore, I mean, that's why we are there. So like if this workforce was organized and they were able to negotiate and bargain for their entitlements, then we don't have much of a relevance. So I mean, organizations like us, very few of us, stepped in and tried to see if mass organizing is not possible, what else is possible. So our approach was that even if there is a very small trade union, it has the potential of really taking at least some cases to the courts, win some cases in the courts, and also link up, with international campaigns, consumers in the West, and do media advocacy, so it's basically to make these issues visible. And I must say that some of the international campaigns did succeed in shedding some light to the terrible conditions in some of the supply chains, and we can now see that there is talk about responsible business conduct. There is talk about due diligence. I think this is all on the back of I mean, decades of suffering, of these workers in the factories and the farms.
And you mentioned that there was some small organizing. Do you have particular examples of where workers were able to organize successfully? And as you say,
yeah, I mean, see, at least we try to do what's called pre-union social organizing. This is not social work. This is aimed at organizing into unions. But we organize in the communities rather than in the factories. Because I mean, the managements are pretty hostile to any kind of organizing. So, and the workers don't want to lose their job. If you lose your work, you are not able to pay your monthly wages, because 95, 99, I mean, almost all the workforce lives in rented accommodation. They come from rural areas, near and far, and they don't have any assets at all. Whatever assets they have is back in the village, a little piece of land, or many of them even don't have that. So so the job is extremely important for survival. That's their livelihood. So they would rather just listen to the supervisors, endure the hostile conditions, endure the harassment, rather than organize. So the approach we took was that bring together workers in the communities, and when they are able to stand up for themselves with the support of other civil society organizations. I remember doing fact finding. There were suicides in factories. There were suicides 15 years back, 20 years back, group suicides. I remember one woman died in the toilet of a big factory. So we did fact finding, but the help came mainly from academics, law schools, civil liberties organizations, women's organizations, transgender organizations, So we all came together as civil society to support the workforce, Yeah, but then all this effort resulted in small trade unions being formed, and challenging the completely kind of, I mean, they'll say, the management will say, this is our fort, and we manage labor through force. I mean, I'm not inventing these things, I mean, I've heard this being spoken in meetings, So and it's true even today. I mean, because inspection is far in between. Of course, there are more and more social audit, but the workers don't open their mouth when there is social audit, because they will be noted. There is something called fake audits happening in the factories. The management recruits somebody to go around like a social auditor from a brand company, and the woman and the workers tell them, what's actually happening, and then you are called next day to the human resource manager's cabin and said, if you are going to say this, you will be fired, and the factory will also be closed. So there is, I mean, I'll vouch for it. Every day there are human rights violations in every factory. I'll vouch for it. So it doesn't come up. It doesn't surface. Auditing doesn't show this, and the companies claim, that it doesn't show up in our audits. That's the reply. If you challenge them, most of them will say it doesn't come up in our audits. And the first item in the code of conduct is freedom of association. And where are the trade unions? I mean, show us the trade unions. If you value freedom of association, yeah, of course, you can't expect brands and suppliers to promote unionizing, but at least you must not be harming unionizing, and that's what the law says. Yeah, if you prevent, if you prevent unionizing, then the workers can go under unfair labor practices. Yeah, but it's an uphill task, to realize the most fundamental labor rights, one of the most fundamental labor rights, which is freedom of association.
Sorry to interrupt, Gopinath. Sandhya, can we take a few questions now?
I've just got a couple more, Alina, and then we'll take questions. Okay.
Okay.
So Gopinath, you mentioned your work in plantations. You mentioned the work that Cividep does in plantations.
Yeah. You want me to speak more about it?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, as I said earlier, Plantation Labor Act was one of the labor laws which was implemented more effectively, especially in the South. I wouldn't say that about Assam. I wouldn't say that, but at least in the South, in the Nilgiris and the plantations in Karnataka, they were more or less implemented. Yeah. And that really did benefit workers. There was some housing, not perfect, tile roofed, leaky houses, but there were houses, and then toilets and sanitation and some schools nearby. So relatively, the plantation workers were sort of, more humane conditions. There were problems always, but more humane. And what has also happened in South India and in the plantations is that because of the governmental intervention, it's not just the plantation management's charity, but because of the general social development by the southern states, especially Tamil Nadu, the general level of education, life expectancy, I mean, all those indicators improved, and more children started going to school, and they wouldn't want to go and work in the plantations. You don't want to be bitten by a snake. You don't want to be plucking tea leaves. Day and night. Sometimes even night. So what's happening is there's a generational change that is happening in the plantations. There are migrant workers coming from Bengal, and Assam and other eastern states, and all that was gained by the earlier generation of workers under the Plantation Labor Act is now being lost, because these migrant workers, are treated, are really treated pretty badly, and sometimes, this housing and all these things are denied. They are contractual workers, they are not permanent workers, so they are not. Many of them are not on the rolls, So I mean, the new generation of migrant plantation workers are back to zero. Yeah. So.
Good. All right. So we'll carry on our conversation, Gopinath, about what can be done in a minute. But Alina, we'll take some questions now. Thank you.
Sure. So, do you have access to the questions window, Sandhya? Or
Yeah.
I am happy to read out a few questions to you. So, SK Chaturvedi asks that their tribals in India are constantly fighting for their rights. However, the contractors in the area also don't seem to provide them with the same.
Okay, so I suspect that's a question for GOPINATH. Thank you, Alina. So thank you for that question. GOPINATH.
Yeah, I mean, indigenous people, indigenous people have their issues, not just in India, everywhere, for being indigenous people, for not having ideas of private property, for being more community oriented, so indigenous people have serious problems, marginalized, extremely marginalized, I've seen people, tribal people in the plantation towns, coffee plantation towns of my own state, Karnataka, lying on the floor, end of the week. The well-to-do will point them out, that indisciplined people, but the fact is that, they don't have proper houses, they don't have. I mean, the discrimination against them is heartbreaking. You can't treat human beings like that. So the indigenous people are looked down upon, and treated very badly. They are used as labor. They don't even find regular employment. Usually in the coffee plantations, it's other people who come. I mean, I have no complaint against other people being employed in coffee plantations, but indigenous people who belong to that area, I won't take the names of big names. We are continuously being threatened of lawsuits against defamation. But I mean, you publish a report and we are threatened of defamation suits. And we have been sued, but some of these big companies, who have reputations, they don't employ these indigenous people, peripheral work, just peripheral work, lopping of trees or more dangerous work. But actual paid regular work, you can't find indigenous people. So the question there is, yes, these are the most marginalized people. These are the most marginalized people. It's really painful to see, how generations of them are being destroyed. Their population is going down. Genocide might be too much to say, but there is a systematic erosion, of their livelihoods, and their right to humanity. I will say this without any doubt. And the person who asked the question might have experienced this.
Thank you for that question. Alina, are there any other questions? We can move into our question discussion now.
Yes, please. Yes, please. So there's this question from one of our Facebook Live participant, Elena Kale. She asked, is India one of those countries that argues, quote unquote, oh, we don't need to ratify the convention because our domestic law is already sufficient? As far as she understands, this is what many European states say regarding refugee conventions.
And is this with regard to the, well, you probably don't, so that's an interesting question. I suspect it's directed at the question of the lack of ratification of freedom of association, the core conventions. So this intrigues me. Why does India not ratify this? Gopinath, I know you had a couple of thoughts on this. I'm not sure it was to do with already defined.
Yeah, I think, the central trade unions have always been campaigning, for ratification. So the central trade unions have always been campaigning, and I think the state response is that basically we don't want government employees to have the right to strike, in which case, it's a question of national security. So this is the main argument, Yeah. So
I think that's part. Yeah. Please go ahead. Sorry.
No, I mean, this is the main arguments from the government side. That we cannot allow government employees to organize. Yeah.
And
I think this partly answers. Sorry, Sandhya.
You go on, Alina.
I think it partly answers one of the other questions by Amit Verma, who asked if either of you could comment on trade associations, because he thinks that they are playing a better role than trade unions, and at least in the case of Indian tea plantations in Assam, in terms of with respect to protecting rights of smallholder tea growers. Do you?
So
Can I take that, Sandhya? Can I take
yes,
that?
of course you can.
Okay,
Yes, please.
yeah. I mean, I wouldn't condemn all the trade associations. Okay, they are worthy men, really. But just a month back, amidst COVID, we had a very proactive labor commissioner. He did a lot of serious work in reaching food, dry rations, cooked food, to those who are really miserable. It was a tough job, and the labor department was looking after providing food. This man tried to implement the central government's directive, saying that companies must pay wages during the lockdown. And the trade association, I wouldn't name them, it's all on public, you can Google and find out, a trade association went to the chief minister and got him thrown out. I have the letter with me, the letter that the trade association wrote to the chief minister, saying, these are elements, which are creating difference between workers and employers, and he must not have a place in policy making. You see, this is what is being said. So he was thrown out in a matter of 48 hours. A trade association got a proactive labor commissioner thrown out 1.5 months back. So is this what we expect from trade associations? I mean, this might be one example, but yeah, I mean, other colleagues in trade unions and all, may have a lot to say about trade associations.
Thank you, Gopinath. I think a lot of our questions that are coming in from the Facebook Live sessions are directed mainly towards the kind of blanket suspension that has been happening labor rights during the COVID lockdown period across different states. And it's really a worrisome situation for the informal laborers, and they actually are concerned and asking that, is it as dispensable just as externality, or the learning from pandemic should direct us to provide more protection to labor?
You repeat that.
Yeah, so I was saying that most of the questions that are coming in on our Facebook Live are directed to the blanket suspension of labor rights across states, Indian states, at the time of economic breakdown. And so the question is it as dispensable just as an externality, or the learning from the pandemic should direct us to provide more protection?
Someone has got children in the background. I understand children have to exist, but it may be that we should mute participants and then unmute the presenters again. We're getting complaints from the participants.
No, the participants are muted actually. I think, yeah, so I think Gopinath has muted himself. So
Okay.
it's the basic blanket suspension of, labor rights that they're concerned about.
And what was the question?
The question is it as dispensable just as an externality, or learning from the pandemic should direct us to provide more protection to informal laborers? I think Gopinath is
a really good question, and I think this is this is why I think if there's one thing you take away from this week, it's Professor Deva's point about the fact that 9 states have suspended labor laws on time, wage, union, all the basics, doesn't absolve companies from their responsibility to respect human rights. And that's a massively important point. I mean, my own view on the suspension of, I was at a webinar with which there were some judicial presenters from India, and one of them quite clearly viewed it as a you know, fundamental to the rule of law and a breach of the rule of law to suddenly suspend these labour rights. The other participant who answered my question said, well, you've got to look at this in the context of Indian labour law reform. The constitutional principles still apply. But to me, as a labour lawyer, it's far more important. A worker, that Bangladeshi chef that I mentioned, he understood about his pay slip. He understood that it would have specific figures on it. You know, a constitutional principle is far more difficult for someone to understand. They understand their pay packet. They understand when their working day should end. And that's what I, as a lawyer, find very worrying about the suspension of labour rights. Plus, I mean, as I understand it, and as I say, I'm you know, I don't know the details of it, but the ordinances, the political motivation behind them is, you know, as I understand it, the idea that you attract investment, which just seems to me a bizarre race to the bottom. Gopinath may have something to add to this, because I understand there was an attempt to suspend labour laws in this way in Karnataka, which was then reversed. Gopinath, can you come in?
Yeah. I mean, there was a order increasing work hours to 10 hours, you know, yeah, 10 hours, if I remember correctly. I don't know whether it's 12, you know, anyhow, I think it was 10. And there was a lot of pushback, you know, from trade unions, and in a few days, you know, it was reversed. Yeah, but of course, you know, Karnataka also has the fame, you know, for stopping trains, you know, carrying migrants. They actually stopped trains, you know, canceled trains getting migrant that were supposed to take migrants back to the eastern state and northern states mostly. But there was a big outcry, and you know, it's like slavery. Yeah, you stay here and work for us, you know. But then in a few days, you know, it thought politically it might be costly, and then it was reversed. Yeah.
Is there another question?
Thank you, Gopinath. Yes. So there's another question by Soumya Bajpai. She asks, how legitimate is the issue of violation sovereignty principle claimed by India and other nations who feel threatened in adopting international laws?
That's a very good question. I mean, the whole point of the United Nations and the post-war pact is that, and you know, I think, you know, India is now stepping up to this, but it seems to me the whole point of international law is it's agreed by the states. So, I mean, one would have to look at each claim to challenge to sovereignty, but the whole point of international human rights is predicated on states agreeing. It's already, we saw the you know, the division of the Universal Declaration into two covenants because of that. And you know, quite often states will raise sovereignty because they don't like the application of the particular right, which they agreed in theory, being applied in practice to themselves by the people within their territory. I mean, well, you're welcome to come back on that, because I think it's an excellent question. And both India and of course China has argued that quite a lot. Gopinath, did you have anything to add?
No, not on the sovereignty question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Next question, Alina. Have we got other questions?
Yes.
Just something, you know. I mean, there is news from Vietnam, you know, that they have signed some of the conventions, you know, very recently. As I think, you know, this was a deal for the free trade agreement with European Union. Just recently, I mean, I don't know the whole detail, you know, but definitely Vietnam has ratified, you know, some of the conventions, you know. Yeah.
The other question that we have by Dhwani Jain is, human rights are better taken care in a localized economy or a globalized economy? What are your thoughts on this?
I mean, that's an excellent question. Can I deal with that first, Gopinath? So really, we could, It's a really, really good question, actually, if I may say so. And you look at the example of Leicester, the fact that people were, and actually it was the investigation talked about a chap from India. There were lots of people who came from Gujarat to work in Leicester. It's perhaps a little easier to uncover breaches of human rights in a local territory. It's just that bit harder, isn't it? And the other thing which it raises, which is also an excellent question, is you have heard on this course about the need for parent companies to move from a shareholder approach to a stakeholder approach. So looking at consumers, looking at employees, looking at communities. And a lot of them do that, and there's a big move to do that now in Europe and in the UK. But I went to a webinar the other day, and there was a very enlightened business executive talking, and they said, well, we have, our stakeholders are our employees and the communities. And it occurred to me that what was left out of there, perhaps not deliberately, perhaps they do include them, was workers down supply chains. And so I think the particular problem that a global economy gives rise to is the movement across country, where the visibility, partly because of casualisation, but also because of sheer distance, gives rise to particular problems. And so in a way, the answer to your question is yes. It may be easier in a localised economy, but the Leicester example shows us that problems still happen. Gopinath, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, but what is the prospect of localized economies? At a time when we are talking about, new kinds of work, we are talking about artificial intelligence. We talk about augmented, intelligence and augmented realities. So, what is the prospect? I've visited a Vietnamese garment factory, very sophisticated, and the number of employees were just about 400. A similar factory in Bangalore will have at least 4,000 workers. So are we saying that our entrepreneurs will not adapt the most advanced technologies if they are available? So this will be the case of our ambassador cars, and premier cars, once upon a time. So I don't think the middle class demand, for better goods will allow, countries like ours to become so-called, in quotes, backward. They want the most sophisticated products in the world. So how can we believe, that we will become a more localized economy? The other thing is this, still 60% of us are rural, and the only green shoots that we see in India now is the agriculture sector. But what kind of a society is in the villages? The untouchables, the Dalits are at the far corner. Casteism is still very strong. People are killed, for marrying somebody from another caste. So do you want to go back to that society? And why did all these young men and women come away from those villages? It is not just for economic this one. It's also for liberty. It's also for the anonymity of the city, which doesn't pin them down into their caste, into their streets. So we are a hugely divisive society, a divisive country. And the middle class saw this, only when we saw thousands of people trekking back home, and that's only part of the story.
Gopinath has raised a point which I also ought to add to, which is in response to the question, which is it may be that good technology, at least in some part, is more, you could have poor technology and not have visibility to your factory in Leicester, but good technology and have visibility to your factory in Noida. It may change things slightly in terms of the localized global argument, but there's certainly a cross-country inequality there that needs to be looked at. Elena, is there other questions?
Yes, one very interesting question that came up just now from the Facebook Live session. So Neha Rane asks, there is a visible increase in employment in farmed labor along with agribusiness employment during the pandemic. Should the central government move towards ensuring labor rights in farm sector?
Gopinath, do you want to deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the least implemented laws is the minimum wages in agriculture. Yeah, I mean, with the caste relationship, with the feudal relationship in the rural areas, yeah, I don't want to go to the extreme, but you can get killed for asking for more. You see, so yeah, I don't know. I mean, many parts of India in the rural areas, it's the landowners are so powerful, that you don't dare to even ask for implementation of laws. The Land Reforms Act of Karnataka is an example. It is only in a district, the southernmost district, where there was a socialist movement, a longer strong socialist movement, where the Land Reforms Act was implemented, which means that a plower of the land, who has tilled the land for 12 years, gets the ownership. Okay, but nobody would dare to give the declaration. Yeah, he must have plowed the land for 25 years, but he wouldn't claim it. So, so apart from Kerala and the southernmost part of Karnataka, I don't think anywhere the Land Reforms Act has been implemented. And I think it finds mention in our directive principle, redistribution of land. Just try that now. Yeah.
Thank you. And one last question from before Sandhya takes over. I think the participant wants us to throw some light on, there seems to be some overlapping with Plantation Labor Act and CSR in India. Would you like to comment anything on that?
I think that's one for Gopinath, Alina. The Plantation Labor.
The question is not very clear. The question is not very clear.
They're asking, there seems to be overlapping sections with Plantation Labor Act and CSR in India.
I mean, I'll leave Gopinath to address it in a minute, but from a lawyer's point of view, the Plantation Labor Act, I mean, that tells me it's legislation and therefore it's binding. Whereas CSR, as you know from the webinars yesterday, is so far voluntary unless you're in, mandatory due diligence in France and other countries. But Gopinath, did you have anything you wanted to add to that? I mean, I don't know whether the questioner can write a follow-up so we know what the concern.
Yeah, but there is a peculiar legislation on CSR, which I'm not an expert on, and there might be a point in what the questioner is asking, but I'm not able to answer that.
Well, what we'll do is perhaps if there are outstanding questions, we'll come back. We'll answer them by email, and we'll look at the chat after. Alina, we have a poll too to put out if people would like to fill it in.
Sure.
Can you answer this with us then?
I am just putting it up.
Okay.
Requesting everyone to please lock in their responses, and we'll be closing the poll in about a few seconds. Thank you.
Excellent.
See the poll responses.
So 19% of you outstanding wages are paid, a smashing 71% respect labour rights and prevent starvation. I'm very interested in the 3% who say that supplier companies are responsible for the people who employ them, and 7% responsibility of the state. If this were face to face, I'd ask you to perhaps share your views, but unless you're quick with the chat, we won't be able to do that. But that's very useful. Are there any other questions. I can see there are a few questions still coming through, but I can't. Ah, yes, PLA is for plantation workers and CSR is for community social welfare of larger areas. I think we may have to come back to you on that. I mean, if there's an overlap, there's an overlap. There's clearly an overlap in many aspects of this. Anyway, it's if there's an inconsistency that I suppose you adopt the more protective approach. If you're subject to a mandatory duty, that overrides the voluntary duty. But that may not be the question you're asking. So feel free to put it in the discussion box. Are there any other questions, Alina?
No, I think.
Okay. Well, thank you all for logging into this. We hope it was a useful webinar, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the week of this course. Thank you to Oxfam for organising. You have Gopinath and my details. Please keep in touch. Please keep learning and engaging with this key topic today. And we wish you all the best.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
See you for tomorrow. Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Bye.